All right, we're going to move back into our presentations. Up next, we have TJ Draper. He's going to be talking about custom app development with EE. Very excited to have him back on the stage here. Couple quick notes before we jump into that. Please do remember to submit speaker feedback. Also, just want to, by show of hands, see how many of you have submitted a submission for the roundtable today. Can we change that? Please. We are actually going to be offering some of the O'Reilly books that we came in through with our sponsorship to people whose questions get selected for the roundtable. So a little incentive to get your questions and nominations in there. So with that, TJ.
Okay, the familiar buzzing pixel green slides, if you've seen any of my presentations before. So this is, I have updated them a little bit. This is custom app development with ExpressionEngine. So before we dive into that, just to let you know who I am and why you might pay a little bit of attention to me. You don't have to pay much attention to me, but I built a few sites. I've been working on the web actually since around 2003, and then in earnest a few years later when I started my first job at an agency. And then I built a few sites that you see up there. I do Ansel for ExpressionEngine and Craft. And as we'll be talking about in this very presentation, I do an add-on that's free and open source called Executive for ExpressionEngine. And that's actually going to be part of the tool set that we'll be talking about today. This is my family. I have 4 kids. My oldest is 13 and my youngest is 6. Yeah, 6. This is my beautiful wife, Rachel. So that's my family. So the things that we're going to be covering today are why you might want to build an app using ExpressionEngine. And by app, I really mean something more than just some HTML and templates, right? And so we're going to be talking about how to accomplish that using something called Composer. Many of you have probably heard of it. Maybe some of you haven't. We're going to talk about the Dependency Injection pattern, which I feel very strongly about and is a very important pattern in custom app development. And then we'll talk about bringing this all together with Executive and making it work in ExpressionEngine. So first of all, why would you want to build a custom application in ExpressionEngine when there's things like Laravel and Symfony and all this stuff? Well, the first reason that I can think of is that your site or application is already using ExpressionEngine. And of course, ExpressionEngine has a database and a query builder and a templating engine, and it's PHP based. And when you think of it that way, you're already working in a PHP application. The sky really is kind of the limit, because something like 70 or 75% of the web, I don't quote me on this, but it's a lot is built on PHP in one form or another. You can build an application just as good as any other application with ExpressionEngine, and you can take advantage of a content management interface that already exists in ExpressionEngine, so that you can just build on top of that. The second reason would be that you have a new application, but you're going to have content management needs in that application. So you're going to have your standard content management needs, but you need to build in addition to that. And so ExpressionEngine is a great choice for that, because it is a built-in starting place for your content management needs. Of course, ExpressionEngine has methods for interfacing with channel entries, channels, routes, etc. When you start getting into the PHP side of things, you can programmatically do things with channels and channel entries in the schema of ExpressionEngine. And of course, as I mentioned in reason number 1, it has tools for working with the database and making custom queries and a lot more. The third reason might be that you're comfortable with ExpressionEngine, but you're looking to branch out and to level up your development skills. And honestly, this is how I got started down this road. Is I was purely a front-end developer, and I had reached the limit of what I was able to do with ExpressionEngine templating. And in the front end, and I needed to grow beyond that. I needed to move beyond hacking, and at the point that I was at, hacking stuff in templates is really what I was doing. So that's how I got started down this road, is the need to move and grow as a developer. And even now, I would really kind of consider myself more of a PHP developer than anything. So how are we going to do this? Well, you're going to need some tools in order to get started down this road. As I mentioned, Composer is a great tool that you're going to need in your tool belt in any modern PHP paradigm. There's certainly more than one way to do things. You can download packages and put them in your project and commit them, but we have Composer, so I don't know why you'd want to do that. It is modern and easy to use. And of course, you could certainly do all this stuff in a custom add-on, but when building an application, that doesn't feel like the right choice. So we're really going to be talking about using ExpressionEngine in the context of the application itself, not building an add-on over here in the add-ons folder and it feels like a second-class citizen. So we're going to be talking about an application right in the root of your project, so to speak. And of course, dependency injection. If you use a custom add-on, you could use EE's dependency injector, EE, since EE3 has had a dependency injector, but it's a very manual dependency injector, and so I don't really recommend it. I'm going to be using something called PHP-DI. It's a very popular dependency injector in the PHP world, available through Composer, and so I'll be showing you how to use that. So Composer. Composer is a dependency manager for your PHP projects. And the first thing is, don't be afraid of Composer. I spent years thinking that Composer was something that it was this big bad thing that I didn't, it was just scary, right? And you use it in the command line, but there's no reason to be terrified of it, and it's really quite simple once you start using it and understanding it. Now, sometimes you can face complex problems, but the tool itself is simple. So there's three main things that you need to know about Composer. Composer.json is going to contain all the info about any dependencies for your application, how to auto-load your classes, and that sort of thing. The default package registry is packages.org, so when you issue a command to Composer to require some package, it's going to look it up on packages.org. You can pull in any package that's registered there. You can also have private packages if you want. That's a little beyond the scope of this presentation, but I certainly often, in fact, maybe not often, but I have done private packages, and so you can certainly do that with Composer. They don't have to be public packages out on packages.org. So you use the command line to manage Composer. It's not hard, trust me. It's really easy, and I'm going to demonstrate how easy it is. So in order to use Composer, you need to have PHP available to your command line and Composer installed globally. There are other ways to go about it, Docker containers and things like this. But again, for the ease and simplicity of this presentation, Mac OS users, you can use Brew. Homebrew is literally a thing that is readily available. You can look it up. It's going to be right there and easy to download. And you do brew install PHP, I believe, is the command that you issue. There's a tool very similar to Brew called Chocolatey on Windows. And Ubuntu users can use apt. And if you're using some other flavor of Linux, I have no idea. So let's talk about, I mentioned Composer.json. So let's look at the schema of Composer.json, because this is really the heart of a Composer project. So you can see this is an example, a very simple example of a Composer.json file. This will live at the root of any Composer project. So one of the cool things you can do with Composer, so we're in the require key here. You see where my arrow is at. So the require key defines the dependencies for your project. And you can also define platform dependencies, like this application needs to be running PHP 7.2 or greater. That's what that dependency specifies. You can do that with PHP extensions as well. I need some extension or other. I can't think of it up here on the stage. But there's any PHP extension, you could tell Composer, I need those to be installed. And so then when you go to deploy you're setting up a production server and you issue the Composer install command, it'll immediately let you know if you haven't set that production server up correctly. And then packages can also be required here. I've just done 2 packages just for simplicity's sake and fitting it all on the screen for this sample. So I'm requiring my own cookie API, which I've got out on packages.org, and I'm requiring a package called Slugify. For those of you that are very entrenched in the ExpressionEngine world, what we call URL titles, the rest of the world calls slugs. So Slugify will create a URL title, essentially. And of course, package names have to be unique when they're published on a public registry like Packagist. Let's see. Then another cool thing you can do with Composer is you can have dev dependencies. So in this case, just very simple, I'm requiring PHP unit so I can unit test my code, and I'm requiring the Symfony var dumper because I love the var dumper and I love to be able to inspect variables and things like that. So these would only be installed during development, and when you install this Composer project in production, you would issue a command with certain flags that would say only install for production. Auto-loading is something we're going to be talking a little more about in a minute, but it is, I hate to use the word magic, but because of standards like PSR4, it just works. When you tell Composer, this is where my source code is at, and this is the beginning namespace, and then PHP knows then how to auto-load everything. And PSR4 is the current auto-loading standard. And of course, just like the required dev, you can have auto-load dev. So those auto-loads would only be available in development. So something important to note is that in your git ignore file, in your Git project, you will want to ignore the vendor directory because that's where Composer installs all of its dependencies. You don't want to commit that directory. Composer is going to manage it for us. And when you get to any particular environment, you will issue the Composer install commands to get those dependencies. You do want to commit, it will generate what's called a lock file. You do want to commit that because that's going to lock in your dependencies at the version that when you did a Composer install, and there was no lock file, it generated a lock file and it'll lock those dependencies in. And so the only time that composer.lock then gets updated is when you do composer require some package, and it will update the lock file with just that package. Or if you do a composer update, and then it will update the lock file with any updates that it made to those dependencies. Otherwise, it stays locked so that you have a specific version of those packages that are going to make it out to production, and you test them and you know that they work. So this is a sample of what happens when you do a composer install. You can see at the very top that I issued the command composer install. There's a few more packages than I could fit on the screen, so I sort of did some Photoshop magic there. And then you can see it's installing a bunch of dependencies, and then it gets done and it's done. So what did Composer do in that scenario is it downloaded any packages that you had required in composer.json and put them in the vendor directory. It downloaded any packages that those packages required. So this is where, of course, Composer as a dependency manager becomes very powerful because those packages have their own dependencies, and Composer just downloads anything that it needs. And then it generated an auto-load file that tells PHP how to load package classes and to auto-load any classes that you also specify when we looked at that PSR4 auto-loading namespace. So from that composer.json file that I showed you, this is an example of that directory, of the vendor directory. But what's important in the vendor directory is this autoload.php. That's the only thing that you as a developer then are going to need to really worry about or do anything with. So we're going to need to get that loaded into our application. And so this is an example of doing that. You would do this in a bootstrap file like index.php or admin.php, or the approach that I take. And later on, when I talk about executive, if you follow the installation instructions for executive, it's going to take this approach as well, as I create a common bootstrap file that index.php and admin.php both call, and then I can do anything I want in that file, and it leaves ExpressionEngine's index and admin PHP alone. So here's just a quick example of how autoloading is going to work with Composer. So you see that I have required the Composer autoload file right there. And so now when I request a new instance of the Slugify class, which is part of that Slugify package that I mentioned, what's going to happen excuse me, is PHP is going to say, I don't know anything about a class named Slugify with that namespace. So then it starts going through its autoloaders, and it asks its autoloaders, do you have that class? And when it gets to Composer, Composer says, oh yes, I do. Here it is. So that's essentially a really high-level overview of how autoloading works. And so then we can use the Slugify instance to turn that into a slug or a URL title, which you can see an example of down on line 9. So that's well and good for packages because we've downloaded those packages and Composer knows how to auto-load them. But you might recall that we had this in our composer.json for auto-loading our own classes in our application. Composer makes this really easy. So let me show you how that maps up. So because of the PSR4 standard where we said app maps to the src directory, that's a very common PHP nomenclature. So according to PSR4, that's how that maps up. And this, of course, is a namespace in your PHP class. So app services property entries, and then the class name is import properties. So the app namespace maps to source. The services part of the namespace maps to the directory services. Property entries maps to the directory property entries. And then the class name maps to the file name. That's how PSR4 defines the autoloading standard. And so now, And so now when we call any class under our app namespace, it will get auto-loaded as well. So what about production? Because we talked about the vendor directory being ignored, and so that we're not tracking and committing dependencies from Composer. So this means that you need to install those dependencies in any environment, not just production. So when you're doing it in staging or acceptance test, an acceptance server or a production server. So in non-production environments, you would just run the command composer install. You would do that in dev, you would do that in staging, or what have you. So for production, there's lots of deployment services that will handle this for you. Essentially, what it's going to be doing behind the scenes, or what it might let you do, you might be able to tell it to run shell commands, is you're going to want to run this command, which is composer install, but then you give it a bunch of flags that optimizes it for production. These slides will be available later if you want to inspect that command more closely. Essentially, it's saying this is not an interactive shell. There's nobody actually doing it. And it's saying, please optimize things. Don't install dev dependencies and optimize the autoloader. So to sum up, Composer, it is a command line utility that manages the dependencies for your application on a per project basis. It's going to generate a PSR2 or a PSR4 compliant autoloading scheme for all those classes and your own classes in your application. And autoloading lets PHP know where to locate classes on an as-needed basis. So now we can write our own classes. They're going to be autoloaded. But let's talk about how to best use those classes with dependency injection. So we need to talk about what that is, because I expect for some of you, like me, when I was starting down this path, I had no idea what dependency injection was. So in object-oriented design, a class or an object will often depend on another class or object to do its job. We call that a dependency. And these classes may have their own dependencies or require configuration or some such thing like that. So a DI, or dependency injector, is what is used to manage these dependencies by injecting them through the constructor of that class. Although there is such a thing as method injection, where those you could set dependencies as arguments of methods, but I would consider that an anti-pattern, and so I'm not really going to talk about it. But it is a thing that's out there, and if you start researching, you will find it. So let's put this in ExpressionEngine terms. So this class is doing, it's calling for the channel, it's getting a specific channel, it's getting an entry model, and it's assigning that channel to the entry, it's setting some properties on the entry, and it's saving it. You can see here that so when you call the EE function, that's a global function when you're in an ExpressionEngine context, and you give it the name of a dependency, that's EE's dependency injector, or dependency management. It's going to return that dependency. And here you can see that I'm creating a new instance of the Slugify class. There's arguments about whether newing up classes that don't have side effects, whether you need to inject those or not. But for the purposes of this demonstration, we're going to say that needs to be dependency injected. So the problem here is that this method reaches outside of itself to do things. It's reaching out and grabbing what it needs and pulling it in. So when you try to do stuff like unit testing and maybe the ExpressionEngine context is not available, then it's going to fail. It's going to reach for that. It's going to use the EE global function, and it's not going to exist. And it's really just kind of bad application design. It's doing this in a permanent way. It's reaching outside itself and trying to get what it needs, and it's doing it in a permanent way. It means that we can't swap implementations. We can't mock or stub for testing. There's a lot of problems. So I've modified the class here to request its dependencies through the constructor. We call this a declarative means of this constructor, this class is declaring the dependencies that it needs. So that anytime that class gets newed up, you create a new instance of that class, it's going to need to have those dependencies provided. And so what it's saying is, in order for this class, in order for it to do its job, it has to have those dependencies sent to it. This is a topic for another time, but for good software design, you would usually not require as much as possible concrete implementations of dependencies. You would use something called interfaces. Sorry. So you would require an interface, and then you could send in an implementation of that interface. But it's a little beyond the scope of what I'm trying to cover here, but just wanted to note it for good application design. And in this case, ExpressionEngine's model facade does not have an interface, so you have to require the concrete implementation anyway. So if I were to new up that class that I just demonstrated, I'd have to provide the things that it needs through the constructor. So in this case, I was requiring the model facade and the Slugify instance. So in order to use it in this context without a dependency injector, that's what I would have to do. Of course, that's kind of cumbersome. And it has the same problems we were trying to avoid. We've just moved the problem around. So again, we clearly need a dependency injector. I'm going to show you an add-on later called Executive, which I've mentioned, which Executive includes a wrapper around PHP-DI to make this really easy in an ExpressionEngine context. But for simplicity's sake, I'm going to show you PHP-DI directly for now so that you can understand how dependency injection works. So you would require PHP-DI into your project like this. And then you would set up the dependency injection container. We're just working directly in a PHP file for now for demonstration purposes. So the important thing here is with PHP-DI, I'm using something called auto wiring so that I can do the least amount of work possible. And anything that any class that it knows about and can create, it will. And we'll talk about in a minute how to get around that when it can't create its own classes and auto wire those dependencies. So then once I set up the dependency injection container, I can ask it for that class that I need, and then I'll have an instance of it that it's taking care of all the dependencies for me, and everything's good to go. Now in this case, we're declaring that we need this model facade class, which is an EE class, and it needs to go through EE's own dependency management system. So if I were to try to new this up with PHP-DI, PHP-DI is going to throw an error. It says, I don't know how to create this instance of this class. And that's fine. That's perfectly fine. This is going to happen no matter how you construct your application. In this application, in an EE context, this is what happens. So we're going to look at how to let PHP-DI know about classes it doesn't understand how to construct. So here we've updated the definition of the dependency injector container to know how to create the model facade class. So you can see here, I'm now using this method on the container builder called add definitions. Add definitions, by the way, will accept a file path so that you could define your definition somewhere else. But again, for the purposes of a screenshot, I gave it an array, which it also accepts. And I'm doing what's called a callback function here. So that because when you build a dependency injector container in the context of ExpressionEngine, more than likely you're building this before ExpressionEngine itself is booted up. And so the EE global method there would not be available. And so what we're doing is a callback function. This function will not actually be run until you get later into the context of your application when EE is booted up. And so that it will, when this method is run, then that will actually be available. So pretend that these things down here on the bottom are somewhere else in the application. So now we can ask the dependency injector for a class, and we can get it after EE has booted up. Still slightly cumbersome, right? But I just wanted to demonstrate kind of how dependency injector works. And we're using it in this, the way I've demonstrated it, it's kind of what's known as the service locator pattern, which I usually try to avoid. Occasionally it's necessary. But it's still slightly cumbersome to use in this way. So normally, an application will take a DI implementation or will have its own DI implementation, which it provides to the entire application. And you don't have to request this stuff directly from the DI in those circumstances, generally speaking. So we're going to have a look at how to do that in EE, and we're going to use my add-on called Executive to do it. So as I was going down this road of application development with ExpressionEngine, I realized the need for this add-on. So forgive me for sounding like I'm really pushing my own stuff. It's just that I don't know of another add-on that does what Executive does. So I wrote it to scratch that custom app development itch. I don't make money off of it. It's free and open source. It's out on GitHub. You can download it right here. Or you can, it's actually it all goes through Composer, and there's instructions out there on how to make that happen. So Executive provides a CLI to create commands that you can run separate from HTTP requests. This is, in my opinion, an extremely important part of working with an application, because for years I skirted around this by, like, if I needed to schedule commands to run, I'd use a cron job that called an HTTP endpoint, and then you run into problems with HTTP timeouts, and it's available to the general public, and so you really kind of need a CLI where you can create commands to run separate from HTTP requests in a good application. Executive is installed and managed through Composer. You can do Composer require buzzing pixel executive, and then it will be installed in your application, and then you'll have to do a little bit of setup. It provides a way to dependency manage ExpressionEngine itself. Because ExpressionEngine is not registered in packages.org and does not have a composer.json file, I've built that into executive, so that you can keep ExpressionEngine out of your own GitHub, and it becomes a dependency, right? So that you're only committing the code that you wrote, your domain code, your application code. It provides a way to dependency manage any add-on that's freely available for download. Provides ability to write and run migrations, very important for custom applications. You're almost certainly going to need to have your own tables and schema and things as you develop an application. Yes, I had bullet points for this. Custom routing, you can map a route straight to a class instead of using ExpressionEngine's template routing or template routes. You can render Twig templates if you want to. You don't have to. I know a lot of you don't like it. I've had discussions about this in Slack. But I like Twig a lot, and so it provides the opportunity for you to do that if you want to. You can schedule processes to run and a whole lot more. And of course, as I mentioned, PHPDI is deeply integrated into this entire process. So in order to kind of illustrate this, I'm going to start with routes, because almost any web application is going to have routes, right? You're going to have HTTP endpoints. So in building a custom app, routes are the HTTP entry point into the application. So think of your application sort of like an onion. It has layers. I can't think of a better illustration. I know it's not the best, but your outer layer is your input-output layer. Whether that's an HTTP request or a CLI request, it's going to go through the input-output layer. And so that layer is for directing requests deeper into the application, into services or what have you. So the input comes into that outer layer, it collects the information it needs, it dispatches the request off to a service, which then returns output or whatever it has to do, and then it goes back out through the outer layer. So input, output. So with this routing system, when a route is matched, it loads and runs the specified class and returns the output to the user. So just as an instance, here's a route that maybe I did for a blog, and also the category is going to use the same controller class or the action class, depending on which paradigm you're in. So when this route is matched, this class that I'm specifying right here will be called, because executive is going to route that straight to that class. So you remember this, where we were manually creating our dependency injector container and then requesting classes from it. Well, now, because PHPDI is baked into executive, this is handled automatically by the routing. So the router is going to say, please provide me, PHPDI, please provide me with this class. And then it will inject any dependencies that it needs into that class. Now, what about the case that we had before, where we were requesting ExpressionEngine's model facade, and the DI doesn't know how to get it? Well, executive lets you define those in the config file. So this is config.php. You use the key DI definitions, and you give it an array of your dependencies. And so I'm doing the exact same thing I was doing, only I moved it to the config file. So now the DI knows how to get the ExpressionEngine model facade. So now, since we're talking about routes and HTTP endpoints, I want to talk about the PSR7 standard HTTP messages. Now, hang with me. I know this is a little bit deep. PSR7 defines a response interface for interoperability. So routers, frameworks, things like executive can receive this implementation of this response interface and know what to do with it. So in this example that I'm about to show you, I'm going to show you how to use a PSR7 response interface to make this work. If you want to read more about it, you can go to the phpfig.org and look it up, or you can go to their GitHub and look at directly at the response interface there. So in this case, let's say I have a custom route for home, and this is one of the special keys that routes are just regex, but I also have some special keys like :home that will route to the home page and things like that in executive. And it's routing to this get home page action class, which is invoked through our DI. So this is an extremely simple action class, and I've got two dependencies there, and PHPDI is going to take care of that for us. Normally, I would actually split this class up into two, an action and a responder, but again, for the purposes of the just one screenshot, that's what I've got there. And the problem here is that we're requesting, well, first of all, we're requesting this EE template service. And if you read the full namespace, you'll see that's an executive class, so that it's already registered with the DI. It will be injected just fine. Executive knows what to do with that. It doesn't, I don't remember. I may actually have a response interface registered. Let's pretend that I don't in executive. So what would you do in this case? We're going to make a definition in our config file for the DI to be able to auto-load that. So over in our config file, we're going to set this up. This is a little bit different than what I did before. I'm using the Zen Diactoros package, and it has a nice response factory in it. And so I'm literally telling it to take the response factory interface anytime that's requested and auto-wire it to the response factory implementation from Zen Diactoros. So now when I request this class, I will get those dependencies injected straight into the constructor. And so then I take that response factory, I create a response, I render a template with the EE template service. I would probably use Twig, but this is for the sake of just showing you can do this with EE. I'm providing a template group and a template. I'm providing it some variables. And we return that response interface back, and executive then knows what to do with it. So of course you can see the power here is that you're in PHP. You can do anything you want and then return a response, and it will be sent to the user. So now you are in completely custom territory. You can do anything you need to do in your custom application. Now, if that hasn't been fun enough, let's have some lot more fun. I hope I don't lose you because I love this stuff. I think it's really cool. CLI commands. So we talked about the input-output layer. With an HTTP request, you have an HTTP request coming in, and then you're sending a response out to the browser. That's the input-output layer. With a CLI command, you have a command that happens on the command line, and that's going to be your input-output layer. Applications, a good application needs a way to run commands separate from HTTP requests. You have a whole bunch of stuff you might want to do on the server that you don't want to make publicly available in an endpoint. You don't want to have to deal with request timeouts that Apache or Nginx might impose upon you. And you don't want to tie up PHP FPM processes if you're using FPM. So I actually, like I said earlier, I skirted around this for years by using HTTP requests to run things until I wrote executive. Trying to run stuff, crons over HTTP. Apparently I got ahead of myself earlier. I've already said this. It's not a great way to do this. You have HTTP request timeouts, and that's really kind of a bummer. So executive lets you define CLI commands to run. So during installation of executive, if you follow the instructions, you'll have a new file, which is going to be your CLI entry point. And you can name it whatever you want. The instructions will default to EE. You'll name it EE. That entry point file is a PHP file, just like index.php or admin.php, except that it's going to be for our CLI entry point. In executive, commands are invoked like this. So you use PHP to invoke your PHP interpreter on the command line. And then the name of the file, EE, and then executive defines a command group and a command. So that's the anatomy of a command in executive. As a tip, if you type PHP EE and nothing else, executive will list the commands Laravel style. Laravel does this, and Symfony, I think, does this as well, that that are available. And so here's just to get an idea of a command in executive. It's just a class that's run, a class method that's run. And this is, I've scrunched it down a little bit and pulled some stuff out of it, but this is essentially the cache clearing command that I include natively with executive. You can see that this method is going to be doing the work, and we have some dependencies that are being injected through the constructor. And we take the ExpressionEngine functions class, and we tell it to clear the caches. And this is, of course, I would register this in add-on.setup in executive, but this is where you would define it if it was a custom command in the config file, config.php. And the key up there, clear caches in this array, that is the command that you would type in the CLI. And then you define it. You say, this is the class I want to call, this is the method I want to call, and then optionally you can give it a description, which would be listed out in the command line if you listed out the commands. So some notes on commands. Any commands you provide custom in your application through the config file will be available at PHP EE. The group is user, because that's kind of the nomenclature ExpressionEngine uses as well. Your templates are in the user directory. So I use the group user, and then the name that you gave the command. Add-ons can additionally provide commands to executives. So any add-on can do this. I don't know of any add-on developers that are. Hint, hint to folks like EE Harbor. So it would be the provider. So like executive is a provider, the registered provider. So in the case of executive, it would be a PHP EE. Executive is the group, and then any commands that I have available, the name of the command, like clear caches. Now here's where some of the real power comes in. You can schedule commands to run because executive has a scheduler. The scheduler can run any command defined by the config file, or in the config or in an add-on.setup file. So you have to have a cron job on your server that's running the scheduler, which should run every minute. This is an example of a cron command that would do that on my servers. So scheduling is also set up in the config file. So here is an example of that config file. Let's say that I have a command I want to run every day at midnight. That's a keyword that I can use, and these are in the documentation, the keywords that you can use here. So run every is day at midnight. And you give it the command group and the command to run, and it'll run that command every day at midnight as long as that cron is running. Or you can specify in an integer for minutes. So it should run every 1440 minutes. Executive also has a queue. This, again, is something that I wrote as a need for the stuff I was doing. And at the end, I'm going to show you an example of one of the things that I built using these tools. So executive has a queue. A queue can process things in the background on its own time. And so again, it doesn't go over HTTP requests, isn't subject to problems like timeouts. I recommend keeping your scheduled commands light and then adding large tasks to the queue. So that schedule that we just looked at, I recommend keeping those very light. And if you have long-running things, then you would add a bigger job to the queue. I use on Ubuntu, my servers run Ubuntu, and so I use an app called, or a service called Supervisor, which makes sure that that process that runs the queue continues to run. Because if something were to happen and exception were thrown and it stopped, you'd need something to start it back up. And in this case, it's Supervisor. And executive has documentation and instructions on how to set that up. So this is what a light command that adds something to the queue might look like. And I know that might be a little hard to read. Again, these slides will be available to you later. But essentially what I'm doing is I'm creating an item model, a queue item model. I'm telling it what class it's going to run. I'm adding some context manually to it. Usually this might come in programmatically, but just for the sake of illustration, the context is an array that the method that is run will receive. So I'm just adding some stuff to it. I had pointers for this. And then here I'm creating a queue model, and I'm adding you can add multiple tasks to it. That's an array of tasks to be added to it. In this case, I just have the one, so I add that to it, and then I add it to the queue. And at that point, the server, the queue runner, would then pick it up when it had a runner available. Other things of note that executive enables custom application extensions. I mean, these are things I just don't have time to go into. I'm already pushing 40 minutes. So custom application extensions. You can have extensions specifically for your application that you don't have to write a whole add-on for. You can do it, and you can use a migration to enable it. Custom template tags just for your application. Control panel views just for your application. So those are some of the things that executive enables, and there's a bunch more. So this is where I said I had some real world example I was going to show you. I had a need to sync with Microsoft Dynamics. We had a client that they managed all the property data in Microsoft Dynamics. They wanted one place where they would do that, and it was required to sync to the CMS nightly. And they also wanted a manual trigger of trigger of that sync whenever they wanted to. I'm not actually going to show you that, but that was one of the requirements, and it was super easy to do once I had all the code in place. Required stuff like if an entry was closed manually in the CMS, they didn't want it reopened by the sync, stuff like that. So this is an example of what that might have looked like. I had this command called add sync task to queue, and then I scheduled it to run every day at midnight. And of course, I also had when they would click a button in the control panel, it would also run this task, add sync task to queue. And so here is that light. I pulled a bunch of stuff out of here for this example, but I'm creating the action queue, the queue item model. I'm telling it what class to run. I'm creating another action queue item model. I'm telling it to run another class. So the first class is get data from remote. So that's going to go out to Microsoft Dynamics and pull that data in. And then the second class is batch remote data. So I'm just storing that data raw, and then the batch is going to actually batch it up into stuff that I can add more things to the queue with. Here is an example of the get data from remote. That was the first class we added to the queue. And so if you're not familiar with Guzzle, Guzzle is a composer package that's a HTTP client. It's really great. You can make HTTP requests to your API endpoint in this case. You get back a response. And again, I've trimmed this way down. There's a little more stuff that actually happens. And then I take the raw response and I just put it into a database table. And then that queue item is done. So this is the other queue item that creates the batches. Let me simplify this a little bit. I get then that data that I stored in the database table. I get it from the database. I map it all up into an array. So I have for each property in the array, I'm creating a new queue item, which I'm adding to that tasks array. I add the tasks into the queue model, and I add it all to the queue. So now let's say we had 200 properties. Now we have 200 properties in the queue to process, which are going to be processed again by the server in the background by that queue runner. And so this is what that class would look like to process each one of those properties. I've got some dependencies, which again are injected by the DI. Don't have to worry about that. I get the array of property data. I'm checking to see. We had a special field that was the ID of the property, and so I was storing that in a custom field. I am looking to see if that entry exists. If it doesn't, I create it. And then either way, I get down here and I set all the data. By the way, I didn't include this in the example, but up here with this logic is also where I would say if there is an entry, or if there's not an entry, then I would set it to open. Otherwise, I leave the status alone so that they can manually adjust that as needed in the CMS. So I set a bunch of properties on the entry, and of course this is very simplified because we had to do stuff like mapping up relationships and stuff like that. You can do all that in PHP, but again, this is just a simple example to show you what's possible. We get down here to line 48, we save the entry, and that entry is now synced from Microsoft Dynamics. So that's a real-world example of how I use these tools for a custom application. So in conclusion, I've really only shown just a little bit of what you can do, but hopefully you can see the power of now you're really just working in a PHP application. And so much of the web runs on PHP, we know we can do really whatever we want to do with Composer, pulling in whatever packages you need so you're not reinventing the wheel, but you're working in PHP, so you can do whatever you want. You can do a whole lot more. Executive can do a whole lot more. Check out the documentation. You can write whatever you want, pull in whatever packages you want, and you can have a CMS backing it all. So you can still use the full CMS functionality of ExpressionEngine. I am so embarrassed that I forgot to change the URL. I don't remember what it is either. I'll tweet it out. I'll put it out in the CMS Slack. I sat there last night or the night before, and I created the URL, and then I just didn't put it in my slides. So I'll send that out in the Slack. Anybody have any questions? Yes?
What's the license on Executive?
It's an Apache open source license. Apache 2.0, I think, license. It's in the repo. Anyone else? Yes?
What queue driver do you typically tend to lean on?
Executive has its own queue system. I probably should have. I was not as aware of queue drivers as I should have been. I probably should have used something like Beanstalk, but it is what it is right now. I may in the future migrate to something else, but right now it's just a table in the database, and then it's a script that gets the next item in the database, runs it, it runs the class that's specified. You can actually, I did set it up so you can actually run multiple queue processes, so that like if your server was beefy enough to run 10 or 5 or whatever that looks like, it's aware of the fact that multiple could be running, and then it would make sure that because it notes as soon as it starts running, it writes to the database, this one's running, don't grab it, that sort of thing. And the reason why you might have seen that I split the queue up into two is you have queue items, and then you have the queue model, so that anything that's a queue item that's put into the queue model, those things will run sequentially. So if one of those things is running, then it won't run the next one. So if you have multiple queues running, queue processes running, it'll actually just grab the next queue instead of the next item. So stuff like that. But I don't know if that answers your question or not. Anyone else? Maybe I just confused you too much, or maybe I was very clear. I don't know which one it is. All right, that's it for me.